Today we're going to learn chapter 5, element of reasoning and logic. Okay. Critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content or problem in which the thinker improves the quality of his or her thinking by skillfully taking charge of the structures inherent in thinking and imposing intellectual standards upon them. The Paul Elder framework has three components: the element of thought, reasoning, meaning, thinking; the intellectual standard that should be applied to the elements of reasoning; the intellectual trait associated with a cultivated critical thinker that result from the consistent and disciplined application of the intellectual standard to the elements of thoughts, meaning using your thinking, your brain, your reasoning, your akal to think about something. Paul Elder critical thinking model, you can see the graph here. First, we have intellectual standards. What are these standards? First, accuracy, clarity, relevance, logical, sufficiency, precision, depth, significance, fairness, breadth must be applied to element of reasoning, purpose, questions, point of view, information, inference, concept, application, assumption. Before you have a purpose, you have a questions, you have a point of view, you have inference, you have concepts, you have implications. You must first use this accuracy, clarity, relevance, logical, precision, depth to evaluate all this reasoning, element of reasoning. Then you develop intellectual traits such as humility, autonomy, fair-mindedness, courage, perseverance, empathy, and integrity. So, from this element of reasoning that you use intellectual standards, you start to develop intellectual traits, which I have mentioned earlier. This is Paul Elder critical thinking model. Element of reasoning and logic. According to Paul Elder, there are two essential dimensions of thinking that student needs to master in order to learn how to upgrade their thinking. They need to be able to identify parts of their thinking, and they need to be able to assess their use of this part of thinking. Elements of thought, reasoning. All the parts of element of thinking are as follows. All reasoning has a purpose. All reasoning is an attempt to figure out, to settle some question, to solve some problem. All reasoning is based on assumption. All reasoning is done from one point of view. All reasoning is based on data, information, and evidence. All reasoning is experienced and shaped by concept and ideas. All reasoning contains inference or interpretation by which we draw conclusion and give meaning to data. All reasoning leads somewhere or has implication and consequences. Then we have universal intellectual standards. The universal intellectual standards they are to these elements are used to determine quality of reasoning. Good critical thinking requires having command of these standards. According to Paul and Elder, the ultimate goal for standards of reasoning becomes infused in all thinking so as to become the guide to better and better reasoning. The intellectual standards include clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, logic, significance, and fairness. So, clarity, can you elaborate? Could you illustrate? Could you give me an example? Accuracy, how could we check on that? How could we find that is true? Could we verify the test? Could you be more specific? Precision, can you give me more detail? Could you be more exact? Relevance, how does this relate to the problem? How does this bear the question? How does this help us with the issue? Depth, what factor makes this difficult? What are the complexity of this question? What are some difficulties we need to deal with? Breadth, do you need to look from another perspective? Do you need to consider another point of view? Do you need to look at this in another way? Logic, significant, does this make sense? Significance, this most important problem to consider. Is this so important? Fairness, is my thinking justifiable? Am I taking into account other people? Is my purpose fair given the situation? And so on. Intellectual traits is humility, courage. We mentioned this earlier. Characteristic of a well-cultivated critical thinker Habitual utilization in the intellectual trait produce a well-cultivated critical thinker who is able first raise a vital question and problem, formulating them clearly and precisely. Create question and problems. Create, gather and access relevant information using abstract ideas. Come to well-reasoned conclusions, solution, testing them against relevant criteria and standards. Think open-mindedly within alternative system of thoughts, recognizing, assessing as it need to be the assumption, implication and practical consequences. Communicate effectively with others in figuring out the solution and complex problem. So that's all for today. So see you next week.